It was a simpler time. On a Saturday morning, little children would be taken down to the local barber shop to get a haircut. For most of us, we didn't like sitting still, but it was a time to relax and patiently wait your turn. People seldom made an appointment back then, they just showed up and underwent this strange process which altered their appearance. And this part of our lives was often chronicled in the very comic books we read. Let's start off with Hopalong Cassidy. Here was a small comic that came in a loaf of bread. The story is about a barber who goes crazy after a head injury.
Excuse me, graphic man, but this very comic was included, along with numerous other comics, as the subject of a book entitled Seduction of the Innocent by Dr. Frederick Wortham, who felt that the barber in this story was deemed too threatening to little children. Dr. Wortham describes this panel of a sharp razor and thought that comic books should be banned because of images like this.
Yes, literature lad, Dr. Wortham should have cracked his window after he painted his office, and then we would have all been spared his lunacy. After all, if you can't trust your barber in this day and age, then who can you trust? Who would think to drive a wedge between us good-hearted people and the town barber? Unless you have a reputation for not tipping your hairdresser, there shouldn't be any real problems. I've spent many an afternoon at the barber shop and have always felt right at home. Just think of all the delightful small talk that occurs. Here's Mutt and Jeff 117 from Harvey Comics. For those of you not familiar with Mutt and Jeff, Jeff here is the short barber. And Jeff doesn't really have much hair, so it makes sense that for this gag cover, that he's the barber. And speaking of having very little hair, Charlie Brown's father is a barber. This subject has come up once or twice in the daily comic strips over the years. And Charlie Brown is very sensitive to hearing people complain about the rising price of haircuts, which probably does bring attention to this subject. Andy Hardy gets distracted way too easily for his haircuts, but this might not be Andy's fault. Perhaps the barber should have a wide selection of reading materials, like Dodo and the Frog in Funny Stuff number 24. And if the person holding the comic book allows the barber to read over his shoulder, then everybody wins. Now, if we could only get the barber to not be so distracted, maybe he should be holding the comic. Richie Rich has a robot barber, so there's no danger of human error, but unfortunately, this would put the remaining barbers and hairdressers out of a job. And that would really make Charlie Brown depressed. So we'll just pretend that didn't happen. Now, at this point, the only thing more ridiculous than the mighty Thor getting a haircut is if you tried to cut some indestructible hair. Like that Man of Steel, Popeye. Yes, before Superman, it was Popeye that was indestructible. But maybe this attempted haircut happened shortly after he consumed some spinach. Because years later, Popeye is able to have a haircut just fine, with no one breaking any scissors trying to cut what little hair he has. Which leads us to the big question. Just how does Superman cut his hair? This subject would be used numerous times at DC Comics. In Action Comics 289, a backup story shows a practical Joker about to give Clark Kent a bad haircut. Which, let's face it, in today's society, this would be considered physical assault. Of course, we the readers know why the electric clippers break when trying to cut Superman's indestructible hair. But notice Clark's reaction. He says, "The joke's on you," as if the clippers were somehow faulty or cheaply made. If someone tried to run electric clippers up the back of your head, you probably would have punched their lights out. But Clark has to think fast and come up with some reasonable excuse for having a bulletproof wig, all because Lois Lane keeps being nosy. And it's these types of situations that DC Comics kept putting us through. Here it's no problem to cut Superman's hair, which means you have to buy the book to find out how and why that could happen. In Superboy 63, Lana Lang wants to cut Superboy's hair. It sure is nice to have so many volunteers in 1958. 1 year later, Superboy's father, Jor-El, is giving him a haircut. There appears to be a lot of people interested in keeping Superboy well groomed. Keep in mind, only 1 year has gone by since they last talked about giving him a haircut. But now it's just 2 issues later. That's right. Now it's only a few months later, and this issue has a backup story about a barber in Smallville who notices that he's cut the hair of everyone in town except Clark Kent. And he can't figure out why Clark would avoid him. Superboy tries to have one of his robots take his place for the haircut, but of course something goes wrong, and now he's going to have to allow the barber to actually cut his hair. So what would you do in this predicament? That's right, you'd pretend to be bald. And then tell the barber that you can't grow hair, and that's the real reason you've been avoiding getting a haircut. And in case anybody missed Superboy number 76, don't worry, that haircut story gets reprinted in Superboy Annual 1 just a few years later. So let's face it, DC Comics was going to talk about haircuts and nobody was going to stop them. And it may sound like I'm complaining, but I'm not. You see, I actually get a kick out of all the time Superman had to go through this common, ordinary practice. Well, that is, if you consider going to Supergirl and Krypto to do all of your hair removal an ordinary occurrence. With all this thought and attention to detail about people's hair and haircuts, it almost seems like DC Comics became obsessed with hair. After all, someone a long time ago decided that Lex Luthor should be bald. But that's a subject for another time. So long, everybody.